Welcome back to Classic Stories and Fairy Tales. I am your host and narrator, Jerry Coble. And something you'll notice here of late is that I have killed all commercials to my podcast. Yes, it was nice to get paid, but in the end, I assure you that I thought it just completely took away from the podcast in its entirety. I don't like the commercials. I don't like how they break in halfway through a story. There's a lot of things I didn't like about it. So rather than that, what I'm doing is I am taking up donations via PayPal. So if you're interested in supporting the podcast, this is how you can do it. You can send a donation, whether it be $1 or whatever it is you like, to www.paypal.me/CSAFT So once again, that's paypal.me/CSAFTPODCAST. So with that being said, we're going to jump back into the book Cranford, written by Elizabeth C. Gaskell. And today we're going to read chapters 5 and chapter 6. So let's get started with chapter 5, Old Letters. I have often noticed that almost everyone has his own individual small economies, careful habits of saving fractions of pennies in some one peculiar direction, any disturbance of which annoys him more than spending shillings or pounds on some real extravagance. An old gentleman of my acquaintance, who took the intelligence of the failure of a joint stock bank, in which some of his money was invested, with stoical mildness, worried his family all through a long summer's day because one of them had torn, instead of cutting, out the written leaves of his now useless bank book. Of course, the corresponding pages at the other end came out as well, and this little unnecessary waste of paper, his private economy, chafed him more than all the loss of his money. Envelopes fretted his soul terribly when they first came in. The only way in which he could reconcile himself to such a waste of his cherished article was by patiently turning inside out all that were sent to him, and so making them serve again. Even now, though tamed by age, I see him casting wistful glances at his daughters when they send a whole inside of a half sheet of notepaper with the 3 lines of acceptance to an invitation written on only one of the sides. I am not above owning that I have this human weakness myself. String is my foible. My pockets get full of little hanks of it, picked up and twisted together, ready for uses that never come. I am seriously annoyed if any one cuts the string of a parcel instead of patiently and faithfully undoing it fold by fold. How people can bring themselves to use India rubber rings, which are a sort of a defecation of string, as lightly as they do, I cannot imagine. To me, an India rubber ring is a precious treasure. I have one which is not new, one that I picked up off the floor nearly 6 years ago. I have really tried to use it, but my heart failed me, and I could not commit the extravagance. Small pieces of butter grieve others. They cannot attend to conversation because of the annoyance occasioned by the habit which some people have of invariably taking more butter than they want. Have you not seen the anxious look, almost mesmeric, which such persons fix on the article? They would feel it a relief if they might bury it out of their sight by popping it into their own mouths and swallowing it down. And they are really made happy if the person on whose plate it lies unused suddenly breaks off a piece of toast, which he does not want at all, and eats up his butter. They think that this is not waste. Now Miss Matty Jenkyns was chary of candles. We had many devices to use as few as possible. In the winter afternoons, she would sit knitting for 2 or 3 hours. She could do this in the dark or by firelight. And when I asked if I might not ring for candles to finish stitching my wristbands, she told me to keep blind man's holiday. They were usually brought in with tea, but we only burnt one at a time, as we lived in constant preparation for a friend who might come in any evening, but who never did. It required some contrivance to keep our 2 candles of the same length, ready to be lighted, and to look as if we burnt 2 always. The candles took it in turns, and whatever we might be talking about or doing, Miss Matty's eyes were habitually fixed upon the candle, ready to jump up and extinguish it, and to light the other before they had become too uneven in length to be restored to equality in the course of the evening. One night, I remember this candle economy particularly annoyed me. I had been very much tired of my compulsory blind man's holiday, especially as Miss Matty had fallen asleep, and I did not like to stir the fire and run the risk of awakening her, so I could not even sit on the rug and scorch myself with sewing by firelight, according to my usual customs. I fancied Miss Matty must be dreaming of her early life, for she spoke 1 or 2 words in her uneasy sleep bearing reference to persons who were dead long before. When Martha brought in the lighted candle and tea, Miss Matty started into wakefulness with a strange, bewildered look around, as if we were not the people she expected to see about her. There was a little sad expression that shadowed her face as she recognized me, but immediately afterwards she tried to give me her usual smile. All through tea time her talk ran upon the days of her childhood and youth. Perhaps this reminded her of the desirableness of looking over all the old family letters, and destroying such as ought not to be allowed to fall into the hands of strangers, for she had often spoke of the necessity of this task, but had always shrunk from it, with a timid dread of something painful. Tonight, however, she rose up after tea and went for them, in the dark, for she piqued herself on the precise neatness of all her chamber arrangements, and used to look uneasily at me when I lighted a bed candle to go to another room for anything. When she returned, there was a faint, pleasant smell of tonkin beans in the room. I had always noticed this scent about any of the things which had belonged to her mother, and many of the letters were addressed to her, yellow bundles of love letters, 60 or 70 years old. Miss Matty undid the packet with a sigh, but she stifled it directly, as if it were hardly right to regret the flight of time, or of life either. We agreed to look them over separately, each taking a different letter out of the same bundle and describing its contents to the other before destroying it. I never knew what sad work the reading of old letters was before that evening, though I could hardly tell why. The letters were as happy as letters could be, at least those early letters were. There was in them a vivid and intense sense of the present time, which seemed so strong and full, as if it could never pass away, and as if the warm, living hearts that so expressed themselves could never die, and be as nothing to the sunny earth. I should have felt less melancholy, I believe, if the letters had been more so. I saw the tears stealing down the well-worn furrows of Miss Matty's cheeks, and her spectacles often wanting wiping. I trusted at last that she would light the other candle, for my own eyes were rather dim, and I wanted more light to see the pale faded ink. But no, even through her tears, she saw and remembered her little economical ways. The earliest set of letters were 2 bundles tied together and ticketed in Miss Jenkyns' handwriting, letters interchanged between my ever-honored father and my dearly beloved mother prior to their marriage in July 1774. I should guess that the rector of Cranford was about 27 years of age when he wrote those letters, and Miss Matty told me that her mother was just 18 at the time of her wedding, with my idea of the rector derived from a picture in the dining parlor, stiff and stately, in a huge full-bottomed wig, with gown, cassock, and bands, and his hand upon a copy of the only sermon he ever published. It was strange to read these letters. They were full of eager, passionate ardor, short, homely sentences, right fresh from the heart. His letters were a curious contrast to those of his girl bride. She was evidently rather annoyed at his demands upon her expressions of love, and could not quite understand what he meant by repeating the same thing over in so many different ways. But what she was quite clear about was a longing for a white paduasoy, whatever that might be, and 6 or 7 letters were principally occupied in asking her lover to use his influence with her parents, who evidently kept her in good order, to obtain this or that article of dress, more especially the white paduasoy. He cared nothing how she was dressed. She was always lovely enough for him, as he took pains to assure her when she begged him to express in his answers a predilection for particular pieces of finery, in order that she might show what he said to her parents. But at length he seemed to find out that she would not be married till she had a trousseau to her mind, and then he sent her a letter which had evidently accompanied a whole box full of finery, and in which he requested that she might be dressed in everything her heart desired. This was the first letter, ticketed in a frail, delicate hand, from my dearest John. Shortly afterwards they were married, I suppose, for the intermission in their correspondence. "We must burn them, I think," said Miss Matty, looking doubtfully at me. "No one will care for them when I am gone." And one by one she dropped them into the middle of the fire, watching each blaze up, die out, and rise away in faint, white, ghostly semblance up the chimney, before she gave another to the same fate. The room was light enough now, but I, like her, was fascinated into watching the destruction of those letters, into which the honest warmth of a manly heart had been poured forth. The next letter, likewise docketed by Miss Jenkyns, was endorsed, "Letter of pious congratulation and exhortation from my venerable grandfather to my beloved mother, on occasion of my own birth." Also some practical remarks on the desirability of keeping warm the extremities of infants, from my excellent grandmother. The first part was, indeed, a severe and forcible picture of the responsibilities of mothers, and a warning against the evils that were in the world, and lying in ghastly wait for the little baby of 2 days old. His wife did not write, said the old gentleman, because he had forbidden it, she being indisposed with a sprained ankle, which, he said, quite incapacitated her from holding a pen. However, at the foot of the page was a small T.O., and on turning it over, sure enough, there was a letter to "My dear, dearest Molly," begging her, when she left her room, whatever she did, to go upstairs before going down, and telling her to wrap her baby's feet up in flannel and keep it warm by the fire, although it was summer, for babies were so tender. It was pretty to see from the letters, which were evidently exchanged with some frequency between the young mother and the grandmother, how the girlish vanity was being weeded out of her heart by love for her baby. The white paduasoy figured again in the letters with almost as much vigor as before. In one it was being made into a christening cloak for the baby. It decked it when it went with its parents to spend a day or two at Arley Hall. It added to its charms when it was the prettiest little baby that ever was seen. Dear mother, I wish you could see her. Without any partiality, I do think she will grow up a regular beauty. I thought of Miss Jenkyns, gray, withered, and wrinkled, and I wondered if her mother had known her in the courts of heaven, and then I knew that she had, and that they stood there in angelic guise. There was a great gap before any of the rector's letters appeared, and then his wife had changed her mode of her endorsement. It was no longer from "My dearest John," it was from "My honored husband." The letters were written on occasion of the publication of the same sermon which was presented in the picture, the preaching before "My Lord Judge," and the publishing by request was evidently the culminating point, the event of his life. It had been necessary for him to go up to London to superintend it through the press. Many friends had to be called upon and consulted before he could decide on any printer fit for so onerous a task, and at length it was arranged that J. and J. Rivingtons were to have the honorable responsibility. The worthy rector seemed to be strung up by the occasion to a high literary pitch, for he could hardly write a letter to his wife without cropping out into Latin. I remember the end of one of his letters ran thus: "I shall ever hold the virtuous qualities of Molly in remembrance. Dum memor ipse me, dum spiritus regit artis," which, considering that the English of his correspondent was sometimes at fault in grammar and often in spelling, might be taken as a proof of how much he idolized